Good evening. My name is Josh Bayles, and we're going to be discussing the Boeing 737 MAX crisis. In 2011, Boeing launched a redesign of the 737 to replace a lot of the aging fleet. The 737s have been a frequent flying tool of almost all airlines, to be familiar with us, to include Southwest and American Airlines. The Boeing Max was going to be able to give an extended range, better fuel efficiency, and a lot of other improvements to the design, along with updated electronic systems and the capability to be used at smaller regional airfields. Now, from the launch in 2011 of the design until its first flights in 2015, there were a lot of things along the way that possibly could have been seen as warning signs that we'll discuss later. But the two major contributing factors of the crisis were the two crashes, one in 2018 and then the second one in 2019. Those were really the beginnings of the crisis that we'll later discuss. Now, the crisis itself revolved around those two fatal crashes. The first one was the Lion Air flight, and then the second was the Egyptian Airlines crash. Now, after the first crash of the Lion Air flight, there were several things that were discussed in changes in the aeronautic capabilities and systems of the plane that the pilots had no clue that they were there. Some of these systems took control override of what the pilot was doing if some sensors went off, and others, the pilots didn't even know those subsystems existed. The other fact of that is some of the pilots weren't even trained in those systems, and there were no updated certification tests to go from a regular 737 to the 737 MAX. They considered if you'd flown the 737, an older variant, you were good to go on the MAX. Now, some of the warning signs that there could have been a pending crisis where there's a rapid design process using untested systems. Some of the engines that were used in the plane were a completely new redesign that they had to make adjustments in the system just to get them to fit on. Some of the other warning signs were the FAA delegated the safety testing back to Boeing engineers. So as the plane went through its certification process, the FAA was not part of it. It was only the Boeing engineers that were signing off on the safety data. And then throughout this process of testing, redesign, and the flight testing phases, Boeing just continuously wanted to have their product available quicker than anticipated. So that kind of ties back into the our warning signs we've seen in the course material of maybe possibly lax management standards, underestimating the problems of if you've added untested systems into an aircraft, you don't know how it's going to work out when you add multiple new systems that maybe have worked individually, but they've never all worked in together. And then some of the hubris that Boeing as a corporation could have had because they just wanted to get this product out there, marketed, with over 5,000 pre-orders before the first planes were even cleared for FAA flying, that they were just going to beat out the other competitors such as Airbus with a comparable aircraft. Now, some of the crisis management efforts that Boeing used, they used a message that it was pilot error that caused the crashes. They didn't want to say it was designs of the plane or any systems. They went with the message that it was a pilot's error that caused these crashes, not that the pilots had no control over the error, but it was purely a pilot training issue. The planes were never forced to the ground after the first crash. They let them continue to fly. There was no big deep dive into what systems could have reacted that was made public. Very well could have been there, but the materials weren't released prior to the second crash. Now, Boeing did update manuals and release simulators that could be used almost like an iPad simulator to give pilots a heads up on what was happening. But some of these pilots have been flying for 6 and 8 months and had these warning lights and luckily were able to control it possibly, but there was no clear-cut guidance on how to react if those type of situations happened. Now, later on in the fall of 2019, the CEO of Boeing was replaced. Now, this could be a good measure too late, too soon. We don't know. But as this has continued to happen, Boeing has had to keep pushing back the re-release of the plane back to the airlines with further inspections by Boeing and the FAA to get it to be able to be flown again. Now, some of the containment rules that Boeing didn't really use very well was act quickly and decisively. They didn't want to get out there and put in their message and then do some kind of response to let them know that they're working on the problem. They just kind of let it linger between those first and second crashes. Now, they did not put people first. They let the pilots continue to fly. They said it was pilot error. They didn't do some kind of in-depth initial assessment of what could have caused those accidents. Now, being on the scene, their investigators could have been there, but we really don't know the findings of the first to the second crashes, and the second crash is still under full investigation. So a lot of in-depth FAA materials and Boeing materials aren't available for public release. Now, communicating liberally, they stuck with their message of it was piloting error, and they let the framework be driven by others for the forced grounding after the second crash by presidential guidance being pushed down, or White House influence being pushed down to the FAA for that plane to be grounded. Now, was Boeing successful in this management crisis? Boeing was never able to get ahead of the situation, and they allowed others to frame it by letting the White House and others force them to ground the plane after the second crash. It took government pressure to do that. Boeing was not going to let it be grounded. The FAA was not pushing for it to be grounded. Other countries had the plane grounded after that second crash immediately, but Boeing was going to allow it to continue to fly. Now, there are other technical issues unresolved, such as debris and fuel tanks and a bunch of other things that are keeping it grounded, along with some of the flight systems still not working the way that they were intended or designed. Now, one additional thing that Boeing could have done was really get out there with a framework and let it know that, hey, we're working some kind of systems glitch. We're all over it. We're going to ground the plane and let it be worked out and resolved. Losing some business, maybe losing some money, losing backers' interest, but keeping the customer safe and not allowing the plane to fly. Now, if they would have acted decisively and acted quickly and decisively, updating the training materials and simulators and forcing pilots to become certified in the plane, it may have prevented the second crash. Now, those are some of the topic areas about the Boeing crisis. It continues to unfold. The plane has not been re-released for flight, and they are still working through some of the errors that are in the system. Have a good night.